at the core of the authoritarian project, there is a small group of people that are actually leading the whole effort. And that is usually an autocrat or a wannabe autocrat, a demagogue, and his cronies. And these cronies are, sometimes politically affiliated, or sometimes they're kind of ideologically closer or so, but they all have an interest in actually reducing the level of democratic representation and increasing their power within the system. So sometimes their efforts are going to go all the way into the full-blown dictatorship and authoritarianism. Sometimes they're going to be kind of advanced to the level of what is called a hybrid regime. But what is important is to think about them as a group that is advancing that project. And they're very much like a small dedicated team. They usually start at the margins in a democratic society, and they are kind of in most democracies they are kept at those margins. So, for instance, when you think about like looking at like different democracies, there were researchers who did a research back in 2021 on democratic backsliding, and they looked at all the episodes throughout the 20th century and early 21st century, and they found 96 episodes of democratic backsliding, which means that, like democratic backsliding episode would happen less than once in a year on the global level. So it's not a very it's a rare phenomenon that democratic backsliding happens. And it happens in, let's say, only 2% of democracies. But in those 96 episodes that they found in those 120 years, nearly 2/3, or actually more than 2/3, 68%, broke down into full authoritarian rule. And then there is another 8% where, it's kind of inconclusive. Like it's like somewhere, they got stuck in between. So it can be as far as 3/4. So that means that like democratic backsliding happens very rarely, but when it happens, it's all over. The reason is that institutional frameworks, and we'll get into it later, the institutional framework that we have for a functioning democracy is not very good at defending against those attacks from within. It looks like almost like if you think of it as a medieval castle that has like the outer walls, and these outer walls are very good at keeping the invaders at bay. But once the outer walls are breached, there are no defenses on the inside. So it's very easy to take over the castle once you breach the outer walls. Or, as in the case of Troy, if you manage to smuggle in a Trojan horse, there is no defenses on the inside. So this is kind of like a feature of the democratic system. So let's go back to our players. We have the demagogue and his cronies, like at the core of the authoritarian project. Then we have different institutional insiders, like civil servants, bureaucracy, different groups and institutions that are kind of in a complex system, like a modern state. They are taking different roles, like environmental protection agency, or like a health center for disease control, or the meteorological service, or whatever it is. So there are a lot of institutional insiders that are taking their kind of like how should I put it? Like they're performing particular roles. And then within that, we also have the political positions, which are kind of different politicians, being in like a legislative branch or executive branch. And then outside of the state, we have the larger civil society, both its economic and its cultural and other forms of civil society, different associations, organizations that are outside of the state. And so when we look at it like that, the idea of the teamatocracy is to conquer everything, starting from the state and then taking over also the civil society, while on our side we are trying to prevent that. So if we think about, and I was already explaining the term, or introduced the term of like is a sports match. So if we have two teams, one being teamatocracy and one being team democracy, let's see what are some of the goals that these have. So teamatocracy, which is like Demogorgon and his cronies, what they're trying to do is they're trying to divide and rule the groups on our side, because our side is like much bigger, but it's not so cohesive. So what they are trying to do is pick off one member at a time and then take over that member of team democracy and then move on to the next member. By that, they can actually compartmentalize repression and focus on cooptation of different groups. By doing that, they actually maximize anticipatory obedience. What is anticipatory obedience? That is like you are sitting there and you're like, I better, how should I say, follow the cues and join the team that is winning to prevent being repressed. So it's not really a threat of repression; it's an implicit threat, and we'll get into it a little bit later. So so what teamatocracy is doing is they first take over their immediate surrounding, which is the political party and the political project where they're in. So you have situations where either a marginal political party that is authoritarian is taking over more and more space, or within a political party that is not so authoritarian, an authoritarian faction grows and takes over more and more space. Next thing that the teamatocracy does is focuses on the next. So as you can already tell, they're kind of that their goals are divide and rule and picking one member at a time. And that is sometimes called the salami tactics. That means if you have a big salami, the way you cut it is slice by slice. And once you cut that slice, then you move to the next one. So the first slice is the political party, the apparatus that they need to take. Then the next thing that they're trying to take is the legislative and the executive power. So as you can see, some of the things that are characteristic of autocratic regimes is that there are no democratic traditions, mechanisms, or guardrails within the political party that is in power. Whether this is Orban's Fidesz or if this is back home Vucic's progressive party, or like let's more extreme example is Putin's United Russia. These are not democratic political parties. These are political parties that are strictly hierarchical, and the boss is fully in charge. There is what the Russians call power vertical. And so by controlling that political party, they control a lot of political resources, so they can actually influence what is going on the legislative and the executive side. The next thing like the next slice of the salami that the authoritarians are trying to take over is the civil service. So they are trying either to fill civil service with their cronies or to use anticipatory obedience to get the buy-in from different bureaucrats that work in different uh, departments or agencies. After they manage to do that, then they move on and they usually take on the judiciary, because judiciary is also a branch of government that is kind of independent of the executive and legislative and needs to be put under control. So they then introduce through the parliament certain measures, and then also through the executive branch they actually go on full attack on judiciary. And if you look at many examples, for instance, the most recent being Poland a couple of years ago, when like the fight over judiciary and the independence of judiciary was the most important fight in the uh, like up until 3-4 years ago. Or if you look back, for instance, in Pakistan, when the lawyers movement and the judges fought in 2008 and 9, and actually that was the determining battle of like where Pakistan was going. These are examples where the regimes are trying to take over judiciary, which is the next slice of the salami. Once they are successful in that, then they move on outward, and so now they're kind of going into the civil society and taking over first media, then educational institutions, opposition political parties. They suppress them. They use like uh, strategies that are undermining the election integrity and kind of making it impossible or very difficult for political parties in the opposition to even compete, let alone win elections. And that is kind of like a one slice of salami at a time. Sometimes they don't use the salami tactics. They try to do a very swift kind of takeover, which is to combine like a trigger event, something that is going to be a takeover, and then uh, kind of combine that with repression. But in most cases, it is the salami tactics that create the biggest damage. And to go back to our metaphor of the castle, once those walls are breached, there are no internal defenses. So the way for the civil society to fight back is to find those levers and those ways to fight back. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So there are kind of, as we describe the goals of autocracy, I would like to spend some time talking about the goals of team democracy, because we are kind of trying to figure out like how are we going to do it. And the team democracy pretty much has a three-step strategy. First step is to slow down the authoritarian takeover. So if we are seeing that, like, they're taking over institution by institution and kind of slice by slice, that we kind of are trying to kind of fight every of these struggles, every of these fights at a time, and trying to slow down. At the same time, are preparing for the next step of team democracy is to mobilize enough people to create a moment where it's a turning point and when the authoritarian takeover is stopped. So first slowing it down, then stopping it. And then the third step is actually to organize a broad-based movement to reverse this trend. That actually, the third step is actually the most difficult one, because that requires all of us, all the slices of the salami, to work together in order to overcome that. And that requires for each of our perceptions to change, so that we don't see these different organizations as alien or as somebody we should stay away from, but actually as somebody who is on the same team. That means not just civil society, independent media, trade unions, non-governmental organizations and stuff like that, but also opposition parties, also professional civil servants, also members of the judiciary that are being attacked. So the idea is to actually organize a broad-based movement that is going to encompass or kind of that is going to contain all of these different groups. And so slow down, stop it, and reverse it is the three-step strategy. And so I'm just going to list like 10 or so different things that movements have been doing in the past, and some of that is also from my personal experience. First one is focusing on anticipatory obedience and self-censorship. So kind of creating, so what movements are good at is to create a permission structure or a permission mechanism where it is okay to disobey. And anticipatory obedience is the worst form of obedience, because this is not something where people actually told you you have to do something. You are anticipating that it would be good for you to, how should I say, kind of create anticipatory obedience, and then kind of like just join the team. So I'll give you like a very funny example about that. So last year, Donald Trump came up with this uh, excellent idea that he's going to rename Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. And then one of the groups, in the civil society, so it's not a group that was told by the government to do it. They just thought it's a good idea to kind of follow the cues. That group is called Nature Conservancy. They changed on their website and in their publications from Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. What is it? Like they were trying to kind of follow along and see what the team autocracy was doing, and taking the cues from there. When they received backlash from the team democracy, they actually reversed back. So this is how, like a very simple self or anticipatory obedience and self-censorship was prevented at the very beginning. But we see that time and time again, where like different companies, different organizations that are trying to stay afloat, they just use anticipatory obedience in order to survive and in order to create like a good links with team autocracy. And if we don't address that, this is going to become a very prevalent behavior, because you know if we have anticipatory obedience happening, the space will shrink. It will get smaller and smaller, and some of these behaviors are going to be seen as socially acceptable. Most people are neither obedient nor rebellious. They are actually kind of assessing their surrounding and trying to figure out what is the best way to move forward, because they're trying to kind of avoid the worst, or they're trying to kind of survive, or so it's a big game of coordination, and small groups of people can actually influence large numbers of people just by kind of creating like different pathways for them to behave. For instance, if you have a situation like we did in the United States. There's another example that I'm using from the U.S. when Jimmy Kimmel's show was taken down, and when that actually created like a serious backlash. And we're going to talk about backfire later in more general terms. But when that created the backlash, then people were like, "Oh, we should kind of switch sides and now be kind of enraged by what was going on." But that's not a default. In being enraged or being outraged is not a default position. Neither is obedience. The default position for most people, because it's not their bread and butter, they worry about other things. They have to kind of make the ends meet. They have to feed their families. So they're not thinking about these how shall I say, questions on a daily basis. They're taking cues from others. They're like, where everybody else is going, I should actually kind of join that team, or stay with that team, or whatever it is. And this is why anticipatory obedience is so problematic, because it actually creates a new reality in which it's okay to obey, and then people are just kind of following along. So this is kind of like an important first thing. Another thing that is kind of also important and connected to that is to actually fraternize with the unexpected allies, and that is mean to reach out and to form coalitions, alliances, or even good vibes and good rapport. And as we described earlier, team democracy is a very large team, and it has a lot of unexpected allies. It has bureaucrats who are kind of professional civil servants. It has members of political parties, opposition political parties. It has kind of members of the judiciary. It has members of the civil society. So in a sense, trying to kind of find those allies first at the kind of outer edges and then moving closer to the core of the where the authoritarians are is actually going to weaken their alliance and is going to make our alliance our alliance stronger. But what does that mean? That means that like most of the way we do politics in like as individuals is actually wrong, because we spend most of our time in politics arguing with our political opponents and arguing over our differences, where actually what we need to do is actually uh, look for unexpected allies, look for those who are neutral, look for those who are still thinking where to fall within the kind of split that is happening, and then to try to win them over. If not to win them over as full-on allies who are willing to step in the fight, then at least as passive allies who are going to still be kind of a little bit passive, but on our side. And that's why kind of fraternization is an important part of it. Fraternization means that we are reaching outside of our immediate coalition and trying to fraternize with people who are not seen as part of our coalition per se. If you look at like what is happening on social media, a lot of it is actually sowing discord and kind of rage baiting and creating points of disconnect and argument between people. And in a sense, like everything that is happening there, we should do the opposite. And this is why like social media has such a kind of negative influence on democracy and kind of supports all these authoritarians, because it amplifies the salami tactic approach, because it compartmentalizes each of us, and we have to kind of overcome that. So that is fraternizing with the unexpected allies is an important strategy, but also is cultivating solidarity within our immediate coalition. That means that we need to kind of start building mutual aid, moral support, but also some sort of like parallel institutions that are going to help keep this coalition together. That is especially important when we talk later about repression, because when we have that repression, the only way that we can actually counter that repression, maybe even create the situation of backfire, is if we have that capacity as team democracy and as a coalition of people that have mutual aid, that have not just moral support but also technical support and any kind of other support that is needed. Okay, so these are kind of like some of the things on the organizational level. But when we think about the overall frame, one of the things that kind of research has shown is that in order to overcome authoritarianism, we have to look for their weakest point. And the weakest point of authoritarianism, it's kind of shown like across the globe, no matter what the country is, and no matter what the level of authoritarian takeover we're talking about, it's corruption. Corruption is their weak point, and if we want to go on offense, we have to look for corruption and we have to expose corruption. As we saw in recent examples in protests in Kenya, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in, I don't know, Indonesia, Madagascar, like all these, what are called Gen Z protests, that's the common theme. So you have different countries in different continents, different levels. Oh, I forgot Serbia as well as one of those. Different countries, different continents, different political systems, different economic level of economic development. Everything is different. But what they all have in common is that they had like huge movements focusing on the corruption of the ruling class. And authoritarians know this, and they are trying to hide it as much as possible. This is where we were talking about social media and the internet playing a negative role in the previous example, which is kind of splitting us apart and making us argue with each other. Here, they can play a positive role, and we can actually use those channels to expose corruption. And we saw that in these examples that I just shared. Kenya, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc., etc. Corruption is a frame that is a very, very kind of useful one, but it is also important for it to be accompanied by appropriate method of fighting. So it's not just framing the problem, but actually appropriate method of fighting. And here we kind of go back to like the old tradition of civil resistance, which says, and like research has shown, Maria Stefan and Erika Chenovet published a book, maybe when was that, 15 years ago, about it, based on the quantitative data. Before that, even like, some of the most brilliant minds like Mohandas Gandhi or Václav Havel or, Martin Luther King Jr. And they all wrote about this importance of maintaining nonviolent discipline, because nonviolent discipline for the movement is important because violence actually justifies repression, and because the team autocracy is using repression to suppress the movement. We're kind of feeding into that if we use violence. Another thing is like, if we maintain nonviolent discipline, more people are likely to join the movement. It's actually a lower barrier to entry. And also because violence solidifies the other team autocracy. If they are perceiving a threat of violence, they're going to stick together because they are going to forget their internal divisions when they're facing an outside threat. If that threat of violence is not there, then actually divisions on team autocracy are going to be more likely. And so this is not anything new. This is kind of like the pretty much the whole history of the 20th century, and all the successful movements in the 20th century, actually, and 21st century, they actually used either implicit or explicit embrace of nonviolent discipline in order to succeed, to lower barriers of entry, to kind of make repression less justifiable, and to kind of open doors for defections and loyalty shifts. So that is an important thing about the method. Another thing about the method is non-cooperation, and that means that like our strategy is at the end of the day, as team democracy, based on the things that we can withdraw, our power that we as ordinary people can withdraw. And that power is actually either a consumer power or a producer power. So this is why the two most successful or effective tactics that we see time and time again are either boycotts or strikes. But even outside of that, like any kind of non-cooperation actually undermines the authority of the system, of the authoritarian kind of regime, by refusing to cooperate with it and making it harder for the system to keep running. So that sometimes, as I said, is strike is the most difficult of these tactics, because it kind of how to say leads to like a serious confrontation, especially if we're talking about like strikes of miners, for instance. This was like a big problem in Chile when they were fighting against Pinochet, because they knew that if they go on strike, that the regime is going to send in the army. We had a minor strike in Serbia in 2000, and the regime did send the army, but the people in the nearby town kind of created like a almost like a shield, and prevented the army from entering the mines and arresting the miners. But it is a risky tactic, and so if we don't have a strong movement to back it, strike may not be our first thing that we would do. But strike is a powerful tactic because it stops production. Another one that is kind of a little bit easier is the boycott. And we've seen this time and again. For instance, like the most famous, probably for me, is the consumer boycott in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, which was very important in the end of the apartheid regime. So the consumer boycott is easier because, it's like while the regime may send the army to stop a strike, it's very difficult to send the army to stop people from, or actually to force people to go and buy stuff. And so consumer boycotts have been when they're coordinated, they have been very successful. But even like a smaller things like I don't know how it's called in English, but there are, I think they're called slowdown strikes. So this is like when you are just like misplacing a file, or you're just locking the door and taking away the key, or you're losing a document or an email that you didn't send. These things, especially those bureaucrats that work on the inside, by doing those things, they can actually stop or slow down the regime very much. I see in the chat like working by the book. I was once experiencing like a police officer, like a traffic police officer, who wanted to mess with the driver. So he said, "What I'm going to do now is do everything by the book to check on your car," and that lasted for 2 hours. But it was all by the book, because usually, you don't follow every line in the guidebook. You follow some because you're kind of seeing some things that need to be checked. But if you do everything, the system will grind to a halt. So bureaucrats are very good. They understand how to do these things, and in a sense, we are kind of like, as a movement on the outside, as Team Democracy, we are kind of creating the push, the frame, while they are going to come up with like specific ideas how to do it, if the permission structure is there, if the political climate is such, which is kind of what we need to do. And one more and final thing for our team, for Team Democracy, is, you remember our goal is like slow it down, stop it, and then reverse it. Like one of the most important things about our strategy in preventing or stopping or reversing authoritarian takeover is to create a moment where it stops. And that usually is a trigger event. There is something that happens that kind of results in mass mobilization of the population. But that mass mobilization is rarely spontaneous. Every trigger event is a potential for mobilization, but it doesn't mean that every trigger event is going to create a mobilization. And so there are different types of trigger events. There are those trigger events that are completely out of the blue. So, for instance, if you look at the Arab Spring, the trigger event in Tunisia was the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a street vendor who was suffering so much because of corruption and mistreatment and harassment by the police, that he set himself on fire, which kind of created that mobilization. But you don't know when this kind of trigger event is going to happen. And there were other self-immolations that happened before and after that didn't create any mobilization. So mobilization is really in that team democracy, in that ability to use the trigger event to advance the movement, rather in the trigger event alone. But some trigger events are not totally spontaneous. They are actually, how shall I put it, like predictable to an extent. So, for instance, police brutality. Police brutality is an example of a trigger event that you can actually anticipate it's going to happen, but you don't know when it's going to happen. You actually know, for instance, if you look at the movement for Black Lives, they knew that there is going to be a moment where the police, how should I say, kill somebody, because that has been happening. They didn't know that mobilization is going to happen around George Floyd. This was in year 2020. But they knew that something like that might happen. So they created structures and mechanisms to mobilize people around that trigger event when it happens. So these are trigger events that may happen, and they're very likely to happen, but we don't know when. But also we have trigger events that we even know the date when it's going to happen. That an example of that trigger event is elections and election manipulation by the regime. So if we know the date of the elections and we know that there is going to be election manipulation by the regime, or maybe outright canceling of the elections, or kind of rejection of the election results, we actually, not just that we can prepare for a particular scenario, but we can even put a date on the calendar, and we can use it. So the third thing in our arsenal is really kind of thinking outward in terms of strategy and preparing for those trigger events, understanding in our situation what are those trigger events, how are they connected to grievances, how they're connected to the way people perceive political problems, how they tie to corruption, which we also said was an important frame, and then how can we actually mobilize people around those trigger events. That's the final third piece of the puzzle, but it grows on the previous two, which is building those, creating those behavioral changes, like insisting on, reducing anticipatory obedience, creating fraternization efforts with the other side, consolidating our coalition. Then on that, which is kind of still in the slow down phase, we're kind of trying to stop it by kind of doing the kind of maintaining the nonviolent discipline, framing through corruption, kind of building our capacity for non-cooperation, and then building on that, we are kind of doing the kind of preparation for trigger events and mobilization. So to summarize it, if we think of this as a project where there are two teams, and these two teams have different goals, we understand those goals. We have to kind of think about like, how do we increase the size and the capability of our team? How do we undermine the sources of power of the other team? And then looking through that, we kind of understand what are the different strategies that we can use. The first one being, what are the things that we can do in the immediate kind of future? And these are kind of the things that we can do before we even bring the big coalition together. This is all about creating like new incentives, new permission structures, and the ways of behavior that are going to be useful later. Second thing, we're kind of building on that and creating like our capability to kind of fight back and to stop the authoritarians. And this is kind of really about like, increasing our skills, increasing our abilities, and increasing our numbers and capabilities. And then in the third step, we are actually taking offense, and we are kind of moving into the enemy territory, so to speak. We are now advancing through, like mass mobilization and pressuring the regime to create concessions. There's so many details here that we can talk about, and that are very specific to a particular country. In some countries, especially if these are hybrid regimes, the movements use election to kind of reverse authoritarianism and to establish democratic rule. In some countries, the change happens a year after we lost the election. So, for instance, if we look at Bangladesh, the change happened actually a year after the election. But how did it happen? It didn't happen through election. It happened through changing of alignments of especially the military, but of these institutions that are on the inside. So these things that are, how shall I say, specific to a particular country and specific to a particular time and a particular political system are to be kind of determined or figured out later. But the essence is that, when we think about two teams, when we think about two goals that are in opposition to each other, and we think about two strategies, we are building our strategy and undermining the strategy of team autocracy in order to slow it down, stop it, and then reverse it.